thanks to everyone for attending. Mutassim, do you want to start us off or?
No, please go ahead.
Well, thank you so much. We're pleased to see the interest in this um, really important topic, especially given the events of the last few days unfolding in Darfur. Um, um, and we're here to discuss one of the biggest humanitarian emergencies of our lifetimes, even. Um, the situation in Sudan, but also more specifically about how our report on the genocide can be used for asylum and other efforts to resettle those displaced by conflict in Sudan, but also very specifically, our focus is Darfur. Um, just to lay a little bit of the background as to some of the proportions of the catastrophe. Um, Over 30.4 million people, or more than half the nearly two-thirds of the population, are in need of humanitarian assistance, including 16 million children. 24.6 million are facing acute malnutrition. Um, the funding to respond to the humanitarian crisis is severely underfunded, um, missing 3.7 billion right now, of a gap. Um, And just to fill those in on what's been happening in the last few days as we mark this second year of conflict in Sudan, the Rapid Support Forces have stormed the Zamzam internally displaced persons camp um, over the weekend. And so we were waking up to um, atrocities for which there are really no words to describe. Um, Carrying out mass killings of literally the most vulnerable, those who are starving, and for nearly a year now uh, in one of the most vulnerable places in Darfur and Sudan generally. And as we speak, satellite imagery is capturing active fires throughout Zamzam camp. So where for those who have been following, it's the biggest displacement crisis in the world, Sudan. And we've went from under, in the millions to it's now over 13 million displaced. And just in the last few days, this number will have gone up by the tens of thousands, perhaps even by half a million. As the UN was saying, up to 400,000 were dispersed from the RSF attack. Um, and so we're meeting at a time that's extremely urgent. We can't stress enough how urgent it is to enact the necessary actions and policies um, and support and contributions needed to immediately protect those who have nowhere to go and are fleeing um, a genocidal campaign. Um, And so with that, I will, and I know we're very grateful for the very diverse audience we have, those coming from working in immigration, the community, health, peace talks and mediation efforts, those interested in and advocates new and old to Darfur. And um, we've received quite a few questions about supporting local Sudanese communities, the silence of the international community, uh, how to prove asylum claims, um, mediation efforts, legislative reform to improve responses, sponsorship, and the like. So, we will open it hopefully at the end, maybe to some feedback and responses, but we hope that this will encourage our listeners and attendees to get more involved and work with us as we also seek to respond to the humanitarian catastrophe and to stop the genocide. So with that, I will turn it over to Mutassim to begin our presentation.
Absolutely. Thanks a lot, Yona, for this excellent introduction. Um, and First, just to thank our team for putting this together. I think this is one of the really important events that we think we can help those who, number one, work in the Sudan situation, but also attorneys or organizations with particular focus on supporting refugees from Sudan. Um, just to begin with, as a caveat, we are not refugee attorneys. We are international human rights lawyers, and the idea of the session is primarily to see whether some of our work, products, and publications can help Sudanese seeking asylum. And thank you again for the interest and being willing to listen. And we'll look forward to welcoming your questions, observations, and more. And so, let me just see if we can switch the slides. Okay, so what we'll be talking about today is I'll give you a little bit of a context already. Yona mentioned some of them. Um, the events in Sudan leading up to the current crisis and the dire humanitarian need. Of course, the humanitarian situation that Yon already covered some of it. And then, of course, we want to talk about some of the violations. Um, we have particularly focused on breaches of the Genocide Convention, which we'll be talking about later. But there are numerous other violations, including sexual violence and rape, starvation, the use of children in armed conflict and the like. Um, of course, we'll talk about the report, the findings, and for your purposes as people interested in supporting refugees and asylum seekers, want to talk a little bit about the targeted groups in the context of the current conflict. And then, of course, we want to talk a little bit about or share some of the limitations of our findings and some of the things that we do. Just to begin with, a little bit about our center, the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights. It's founded by our international chair, Professor Erwin Kotler, who's former parliamentarian, Minister of Justice, and the Attorney General of Canada. It's a consortium of practitioners, jurists, lawyers, former parliamentarians, students, organizations. They're inspired by and anchored by the legacy of the humanitarian legacy of the Swedish diplomat Raoul Wallenberg, who demonstrated that the one person as our founder would say, one person with the passion to care and courage to act can confront evil, prevail, and transform history. And so the center is really founded on five main pillars that guide our work and our activities. One is defending political prisoners, one of the central programs that we have. This started with our founder representing political prisoners such as Nelson Mandela, Natan Sharansky, Vladimir Kara-Murza, Raif Badawi, Dawit Isaac, and many more, just to name a few. And then, of course, honoring the heroes of humanity, including the names that I mentioned. And then, of course, protecting democracy, the whole purpose in the end, by doing all of this is to ensure that there's a rule-based democratic order, and then advocating for women's rights, and finally, genocide prevention. And we have been focusing on this part, particularly in the last 2 years in the context of Sudan. Of course, we covered other situations in Ukraine, Uyghur, and the like. Just to give you a little bit of a context in terms of the situation in Sudan today, and I think this will be sort of repetitive to some of my Sudanese colleagues who are here. The reason why we're here today is because of the devastating war that began in April 2023 between the Sudanese armed forces and the rapid support forces. The war was initially started as a war between the two major warring groups, but it can no longer be described as a mere sort of conflict between SAF and the RSF, and cannot be described as a war between um, uh, two generals, the head of the Sudanese Armed Forces, General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, and the commander of the RSF, General Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo. So the war became a lot more complex. It involved many, of course, domestic actors, as well as external actors, with the UAE being the most responsible actor in this case for supporting the rapid support forces. And we have documented that quite a lot, and we'll continue to document. But in leading up to the event of the war in 2023, and for decades, the Sudanese government, subsequent Sudanese governments relied primarily on tribal militias, mostly Arab militias, to suppress dissent and combat insurgencies, and that is and the militia of Janjaweed. I think the notorious militia of Janjaweed is one of them. Of course, there were a bunch of other militia groups before that, uh, and so this is just to say that subsequent Sudanese governments relied heavily on creating militias in the country. Um, Both the Janjaweed at the time, speaking of the early 2000s, and the Sudanese armed forces involved in mass atrocities in Darfur. That is part of the reason why in 2007, the United Nations Security Council, together with the African Union, mandated a hybrid mission called the United Nations Africa Mission in Darfur, or UNAMID, as a key peacekeeping force. Of course, with a limited mandate, not necessarily to intervene with force to protect civilians, but mostly monitoring and documenting atrocities and protecting humanitarian aid organizations. And because of the atrocities committed by SAF and the RSF, the situation was referred to the ICC in 2005. And that is part of the reason why Bashir and senior members of his regime were indicted by the ICC, including genocide charges. And of course, that is also the reason why the United States, back in 2004, made a determination that genocide has been committed by the Sudanese government and its militias. In the context of the earlier genocide, the primary targeted groups at the time were mostly Fur, Zagawa, Masalit. These are the three major ethnic groups in Darfur, but surely there are many others ethnic groups, right? And you'll see some of them later on. Fast forward in 2013, the Janjaweed was rebranded as the Rapid Support Forces, the RSF now, and they were under the umbrella of the National Intelligence and Security Services in Sudan. They continue to commit atrocities and displacing civilians. The RSF and security agencies involved in suppressing pro-democracy protesters, human rights defenders, activists, and that includes killing over 100 protesters in 2013, protesting Bashir regime's policies at the time. In 2017, the Janjaweed, then the RSF, were formally became sort of a state military force by the act of parliament. So basically, the parliament passed a legislation making the RSF a state entity. I'm laying this foundation to say that the RSF and SAF have been involved in mass atrocities, violations for years. And so the current conflict is not sort of cannot be understood in isolation. Um, and then in 2019, after months of protests in Khartoum and other parts of the country, Bashir was removed. But the problem is, and this is the major irony, is that the military, including the RSF, remained during the transitional period. And despite the democratic transition in the country, the rapid support forces continued its identity-based attacks and incitement against non-Arabs in Darfur, or central Darfur. Um, these are primary state where many non-Africans live. And then, of course, we also where hundreds of protesters were killed in front of the military headquarters in Khartoum. And the RSF and South both play a big part in that. And then the two forces, Sudanese armed forces and the opposite four forces, staged a coup in 2021, October 2021, um, undermining the democratic transition. And of course, they never ceased to commit mass atrocities. Now, Yon already spoke about the humanitarian situation, the urgent need for aid in Zamzam, and Al-Fashir, of course, the larger part of the country. And so I do not need to repeat that. But just to reiterate that there are, um, um, about 4 million people sought refuge in, neighboring countries. Of course, the majority of the Sudanese are internally displaced. One of the reports, suggests that Sudan is now the fourth deadliest country in the world. Of course, already spoke about the need for aid and the situation in Al-Fashir, which is becoming extremely, extremely dangerous. And the situation is still unfolding at the moment with limited access to information there. The RSF is now encircling the entire city of Al-Fashir from all sides, and it is really unclear, and we don't know if the RSF would run Al-Fashir today, where the displaced persons would go. Basically, there is no way to go to. Unlike it was in West Darfur, right? People could flee to Chad or maybe Central African Republic, but this is not the case in Al-Fashir. For our purposes, we prepared this slide just to show you the numbers in terms of refugees in neighboring countries. Most of the refugees are in the neighboring countries, primarily in Egypt and Uganda. There are, millions of refugees there. And of course, there are others in Libya, Chad, Central African Republic, South Sudan, Kenya, Ethiopia, surely in Eritrea. We do not have information about how many Sudanese refugees in Eritrea. Most of the refugees in these countries registered with the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, awaiting their resettlement to Western countries. But many have been there for quite some time. So the majority of the numbers here, the refugees you see here, um, were forced to leave after the war in April 2023. So in terms of human rights violations, as I mentioned earlier, we at the center documented particularly the violations of the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, Genocide Convention. We haven't covered fully other human rights violations. Um, and so this is just to say that there are numerous human rights violations, not only in Darfur, but across the country. Massive destruction of civilian infrastructure, health facilities, warehouses, and of course, well-documented incidents of torture, inhumane and degrading treatment, rape, and other forms of sexual violence. We've seen this as being used as a weapon of war, particularly by the RSF, and of course, starvation as a weapon of war used by both warring parties. I'm going to turn over to my colleague Yona to talk a little bit about our independent inquiry um, and what led us to, commission that investigation, the findings, and over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Mutassim, for the beautiful presentation. Um, and I apologize. I've been crying a little bit because um, it's a little bit overwhelming to think about how long we've been um, sort of shouting from the rooftops about um, what was impending, and now it's actually happening, like serious, end result of genocide. And so um, I'm having a little bit of trouble holding it together, but thank you for uh, bearing with me. And in we released our findings a year ago, so for an entire year, it's not like the international community was not aware of the rapid support forces practices and how they carry out violence in Darfur. And so even before that, in November 2023, um, following the um, targeted killings and sexual violence against non-Arab communities, but specifically the Masalit in West Darfur, in November when they were taking over Ardamata and carrying out um, more killings. Um, we um, sorry, we um, we rallied a group of experts to alert the international community to the risk of genocide. And after that, after publishing some pieces on this, we then continued to investigate and convene a group of experts to sign on to an inquiry into the breaches of the Genocide Convention. And we found on clear and convincing evidence to show that the Rapid Support Forces committed genocide against the Masalit. And we also identified outside actors as complicit in the genocide. Um, and based on our findings, there was a duty to prevent on all states parties to the Genocide Convention. And so, yeah, these were just, parts of the report that are critical to um, specifically for asylum claims, is that any members of these groups from Darfur are clearly targets um, of the crime of crime, genocide, and we compiled and compared incitement language that was used in the lead up to and actually while the commission of these atrocities, in the midst of um, committing the actual crimes, fighters would recite a lot of these or explicitly state a lot of the um, dehumanizing language that drives these sort of atrocities and paints the entire community in this um, dehumanized way that makes them targets for destruction, essentially. Um, and I guess we can go on to the next slide, but the documentation over the past year has continued, um, and so the RSF's modus operandi hasn't changed. Um, and so, as for targeted groups, I think Mutasim might be able to explain this part a little better, but I'll,
Sure, absolutely. Thanks a lot, Yona. And as you can see from the incitement slide, basically, the RSF and the allied Arab militias use the same dehumanizing language that you used a while back, right? Early 2000s, referring to um, non-Arabs as slaves or dogs, and basically conditioning their soldiers to brutally kill them. And so that's one reason why we see how brutal the killing was in West Darfur. It was celebrated by the community in West Darfur. Um, of course, these atrocities by the RSF and the Arab militias against the same Salid for Ruzagawa that have been targeted, um, decades ago. So we're speaking of the same target groups that nothing changed. And as I mentioned earlier, for Zagawa and Masalit, these are the major ethnic groups or the central ethnic groups in Darfur, but there are many others. So just to begin with, Masalit is uh, mostly in West Darfur. Um, and But again, of course, there are others who are non-Masalit in West Darfur, for example, Borgo, there's Zagawa, there are four, there are Tama. These are non-Arabs in West Darfur. So they've been also targeted by the attacks of the RSF. Um, but During the 2023 attack, when the RSF was carrying out the attack, they specifically asked people whether they are Masalit or not. And so if you're Masalit, then you would be killed. And if others, you may have a chance to leave. Then for another major ethnic group, um, and they're mostly in the central Darfur, specifically around the Jabal Marra region. This is like a massive region that centers Darfur. Of course, Darfur also is present in other parts of Darfur, in South Darfur, in North Darfur, West Darfur, yeah, and across the region. And then we have Zagawa. They're mostly in North Darfur state. They're mostly in the Tina or Wadi Hawar and far northern Darfur. But they're also present in other parts of Darfur. Um, for example, in South Darfur, in Nial in particular, um, in Sharia and other places. Um, and then, of course, in addition to these three major ethnic groups in Darfur, there are others such as Daju, Tunjo, Burkit, Broti, Renga, Gimiran. There are many um, um, uh, non-Arabs that are also persecuted by the Arab groups. Um, and this is just to say that if you're a refugee lawyer and you have, other non-Arabs, right, like other than for Zagawa and Masalid, it is possible that they are persecuted. Um, um, yeah, so just to perhaps end here, and maybe you can revisit some of the things that we mentioned earlier. And of course, welcome your questions and also revisit some of the questions that you sent. Um, some of the limitations of our report is that we particularly focused on um, the events between April 15, 2023 and April 15, 2024, just 1 year sort of mark. And so the evidence and the information that we have does not cover the entire country and does not cover a limited period of time. Um, this is just for your consideration. Second, um, as we mentioned, we focus primarily um, on genocide, which is very delicate um, crime, and so we focus particularly on analyzing the Genocide Convention, and so we haven't covered other violations. Again, there are many of them, and across the country. Um, that is in terms of the limitation of the report. But we still think that um, it can be used, even though the focus is primarily on Darfur, but it can be used to support refugees from other regions, from Central Sudan, from Khartoum. And by the way, I'd like to note that there are many Darfuris also in other parts of the country, in Khartoum and Al Jazeera and Sinnar and all states in Sudan. So definitely the report can be used to support all refugees or asylum seekers beyond Darfur is. Um, I think that's it. I don't know unless Yoni would like to add additional um, uh, points, and then we can look at some of the questions that we received. Um, and of course, welcome additional questions if our audience or participants have.
Yeah, I think I might just add, thank you so much, Mutasim. Um, I might add just a brief overview of Canada's approach to um, asylees from Sudan, and just quickly compare it to the program that was in place as an emergency response to Ukraine. So, you know, as soon as the war in Ukraine broke out, Canada introduced the Canada-Ukraine Authorization for Emergency Travel. So this is beyond refugee. This is about um, opening a pathway for all Ukrainians and Ukrainian nationals and family members to apply free of charge for visas that extend to 3 years with no cap on the amount of applications. It included free work permit applications, and a processing time of 2 weeks. Um, exemptions from overseas medical exams, um, and prioritization by Immigration, Refugee, and Citizenship Canada, um, including also increased operational activity across Europe to respond to these needs for the influx of migrants from Ukraine. And Of course, I mean, from March 2022 to April 2024, Canada approved nearly 1 million visa applications under this program. Um, and for Sudan, there's no similar program that was introduced. In February 2024, nearly a year into the war, Canada introduced a special program for resettling people affected by the war in Sudan who have family here. That was first capped at 3,250, so 3,250 applicants, and later extended to almost 5,000. Um, but none of the same waivers as the Ukraine program, so there are still processing fees and disproportionately high income requirements. And a lot of families are facing delays in their applications, and there's a growing list of those who have died during the process of waiting for their applications to be approved, or have been kidnapped and tortured. So, um, I mean, th this policy, it's not like Canada can't implement emergency measures in the same way for Sudanese fleeing conflict. Um, and so um, this would appear to demonstrate the anti-Black systemic racism that's affecting policy, the clear disparate treatment between two similarly affected communities. Um, and so, during this election, I hope this becomes a very central, um, at least a topic that gets attention because um, it's critical that at least at home, you know, Canada applies its policies based on an equal basis and treats, you know, all humans as equal. But and so I think, Canada should introduce something that is more expansive. There's now a private sponsorship program that was April 30th of this year that is open for Sudan, but it's capped at 160. So everything really appears to be extremely insufficient to actually meet the the magnitude of the crisis, um, and so I just want to highlight this as a serious need to fix our policy when it comes to resettling Canadian Sudanese with workable solutions that have been applied elsewhere.
Absolutely. So I think um, we we received number of questions, and most of them about how can we help um, um, Sudanese, and uh, I think um, part of the reason why we convene this is because we realized that some of the refugee attorneys reaching out to us using a report, um, seeking expert testimonies and the like, and mostly in the U.S. actually, where the immigration policy is becoming tougher now these days. Um, so um, definitely, I think um, we stand ready to provide any additional information to any refugee um, attorney, um, the US and Canada, elsewhere, because we believe that um, the um, refugee policies and laws are based or supposed to be based on the genocide in the Geneva Convention um, uh, related to the status of refugees of 1951, and therefore I think there could be massive similarities between different countries, especially with respect to the the prohibition of returning refugees to frontiers where their lives might be threatened. And we know that there are, at least in the US, there are many Sudanese um, that are subject to deportation to Sudan despite the current situation, solely because they came through the southern borders. And that's part of the reason why we think it is crucial that if there's anything that we can do to support saving the lives of Sudanese detained or awaiting immigration hearings and the like, we'll be more than happy to support.
And yeah, as to the question about lobbying for better policy, of course, we're working on this. We've actually been working with the um, SCCA, the Sudanese Canadian Community Association, on trying to push for like I was mentioning, more consistency across resettlement programs so that Sudanese asylum seekers and Sudanese fleeing conflict are treated the same, um, and and to meet the unprecedented magnitude of this conflict. Um, but we, I would also encourage listeners to reach out to the SCCA, who are really focused on this particular policy issue and have been campaigning and working with the community.
And other questions were about Sudanese refugees in other places. And I think the answer will be the same. Basically demonstrating the dangerous situation in Sudan and that um, the second flight alternative is not a possibility under current circumstances, meaning you cannot really relocate Sudanese. Say, for example, if you think Darfur is dangerous, and the argument would be, okay, we can, um, you can relocate to Khartoum or, Kassala or any other sort of stable state. But I think even other states that are not directly affected by war are still unsafe. Um, with the ongoing conflict and the use of drones and so basically there is no second flight alternative in the country. That's number one. Um, and now because of the suspension of foreign aid by the U.S. government, it made situation even more difficult for refugees in neighboring countries like Uganda, Kenya, Ethiopia, um, Egypt, and Libya. Uh, Many refugees rely heavily on the aid provided by organizations. They rely heavily on, of course, resettlement processes. And so the direct outcome of this is that many refugees will try to seek, you know, um, less safe or maybe unsafe routes, including crossing Mediterranean or taking sort of irregular migration routes, um, and so one sort of advocacy talking point would be to reinstate support for refugees in neighboring countries. And I must say that countries like Uganda, Egypt, and others have millions of Sudanese. I think they have been generous enough to welcome Sudanese refugees, and I think um, um, it is imperative that capable states such as Canada or the U.S. and um, EU states um, share burden with those um, in Africa. Yeah.
And I guess there's a question about numbers from other countries. I'm actually not so familiar about what the caps are or how the programs are being implemented elsewhere. But regardless, within Canada, these numbers are clearly unjustifiable, um, and are filled immediately because of the needs. I mean, only 4% of applicants have arrived in Canada, or just 291 um, from the family reunification program that has been capped at 4,950. Um, but and of course, Canada is not going to, it's not going to solve this massive problem, but at the very least can extend an open door in the same way that it did to Ukrainians fleeing conflict. Um, Especially now where, as Mutassim was saying, anti-immigrant ideology is on the rise, and yeah, the Trump administration may even be listing Sudan as a red listed country where no one can enter from. So um, it's quite shameful, in my opinion. I mean, and you know, clearly based on this, on the disparate treatment and discriminatory treatment, I think it's extremely shameful that these are capped. Especially, I'm not even sure why this private sponsorship. I would be interested to hear maybe from immigration lawyers. But you know, certainly if private citizens are willing, I'm not sure why there's any cap on that either. Yeah,
And in terms of international community's responses in Canada, I think um, Canada particularly is well placed as chair of the G7 now. Of course, the focus is more on the dire humanitarian situation in Sudan at the moment, but definitely the issue of refugees and those seeking to flee should be central. And so I think there is an opportunity for those of you in Canada um, to use and leverage Canada's status as chair of the G7. And I understand that there is a meeting in June of heads of states, and I think that can be an opportunity to flag any sort of concrete responses to, of course, the broader humanitarian crisis, but also the specific issue of refugees and others. There's a point about prolonged delays. You wanna comment on that?
I think Nuha might just be um, commenting on how there have been um, you know, these cruel delays in the processing, whereas we've seen expedited processing in other situations. Um, but you know, we also received some questions about, I guess, just supporting in general the situation. I think it's important to consider giving to um, the SCCA or other or grassroots civilian in terms of within Sudan, trying to directly provide support to civilian-led efforts like the emergency response rooms that have been nominated for the Nobel Prize, the resistance committees or mutual aid groups and the like, and other advocacy groups that are doing critical work like the Darfur Women's Action Group, Strategic Initiative for Women in the Horn of Africa, and those kind of advocacy groups. Um, because, you know, yeah, I mean, especially the volunteers on the ground are doing the most heroic forms of resistance and work. Um, and especially, and I think it's important now to get organized, really to get organized um, in a similar way that we saw in the early 2000s with the Save Darfur movement. You know, it can be, you know, yeah, I think with the severity and the emergency of what's happening right now, I think it's time to really get mobilized. So I encourage our audience also to consider just ways to locally raise this as make sure that this stays and not just uh, for a few days when there's a massacre going on.
And speaking of support, of course, you don't want to forget supporting our causes, especially the investigations and the analysis that we conduct to uncover the atrocities and the violations, and naming the perpetrators, domestic and external. Um, this has been really one central focus for us for the last couple of months. Surely we're committed to continue on this path. And some of you are already following our work, especially the Task Force for Accountability and Justice, basically working with other stakeholders, especially groups that are working on um, holding perpetrators accountable, particularly external actors. Um, we do believe that the one effective way to end, or at least to limit the scale of abuses and violations in the country, um, and of course to end the secondary problem, refugee, right? Like people seeking refugees primarily because of well-founded fear to their lives and liberty and the like. And so by addressing the root causes of the problem, we'll be able to address that. And and we can't really end the conflict right now without targeting the enablers, the financiers, and the backers of the perpetrators. And that's part of the reason why we involved with others in going after the external actors, and we're pursuing other um, um, ways such as bringing international cases, um, whether through the ICJ or even domestic jurisdiction or universal jurisdiction, where you're just navigating, surveying a bunch of options, making sure that we're going after states and entities. Um, that is a theory that we think would be the most effective one um, uh, to end or maybe limit the scale of violations. I know that some people, just joined us now. Um, I don't know if you want to do a quick recap and um, just uh, to bring you up to speed, and perhaps if you have any additional comments or observations you'd like to make.
Um, yeah, I mean, we've just been reviewing some of our the key findings of our report and how this fits into the global response to bringing resettling Sudanese asylees and refugees. Um, and we are now also moving into a discussion also about our work on accountability, which is our work serves this dual role of both um, establishing the legal criteria for providing individuals with relief, but also serves to form the basis for pursuing international legal action against the perpetrators and the enablers. So, yeah, no, I think it's a wonderful. I'm glad we are bridging these two objectives with this webinar. Um, and I see we have very specific questions about how to prove membership in an ethnic group. Um, I think that that's a little bit would be probably based on the particulars of that case. I don't know if Mutessim wants to come in on that, but we also we can share the slides after that breaks down very clearly the specific groups that are targeted and are potential victims of the ongoing genocide. Um, and Yeah, in terms of can international law protect minority individual victims of genocide, um, it's a whole range of I mean, for one, I guess the International Court of Justice is now hearing this case. Um, and so the International Court of Justice is now deliberating on issuing provisional measures, an order that that may provide victims of genocide with an independent pronunciation of the RSF's potential commission of genocide. It's a conservative court, so I I would we shouldn't expect to use for the courts to use as direct language as is needed in this moment, but because of the emergency situation, the court may well issue provisional measures against the United Arab Emirates to halt its support for the RSF based on its duty to end complicity and prevent genocide. So that's kind of a broader something that we've been working on for a while to try and bring about. But we have another question about losing documents to reduce the amount of money for the. I'm not sure. Um, but about oh, I see. I mean about losing documents. I mean, I know that in the for the Ukraine emergency measures, they they had discretion to issue one-time journey documents um, for certain cases of missing travel documents. And so this is something that I think for legislators and policymakers, I mean, and for people in immigration policy, um, this is something that has been dealt with before and should in cases where you can where it's impossible to show your documents that should there should be solutions for that. Um, and cancel all refugees in Ukraine. Yeah, thank you for the comment on the caps on sponsorship. I'm not yeah, thank you for that. Someone is asking about complicitness with Saudi Arabia. I think that's a bit of a separate issue, Natasha.
Yeah,
But
absolutely. No, I do not have a comment there. Um, um, that's definitely a separate issue. Um, but I just want to go back quickly to 2 points. One on um, how to prove persecution on ethnic grounds. And I think, as Fiona mentioned, it really depends on a particular situation. Sometimes um, immigration officers would like to ask if the asylee speaks the language of that particular ethnic group, or um, any other sort of traits that and um, just to confirm that the person is belonging to a particular ethnic group. Um, but you should also know that the fact that somebody is Masalit and um, uh, doesn't necessarily mean that the person will speak the Masalit language, or the same for foreign Zagawa. So even if your client does not speak the language, that should not, um, exclude him from being a member of the group, and that the person is not persecuted. Um, so that's number one. And in terms of um, of course, it's hard to distinguish between ethnic groups through physical features. Definitely not, that would will be impossible to do. But definitely, your client will be able to tell you more. Um, you know what makes him or her her think that she or he belongs to a particular ethnic group. Um, in terms of the reparations or remedies for the victims, um, of atrocities and genocide who reside in Canada or the US and others. There are really numerous, especially, it depends on where you are. There are different sort of legal frameworks that you can pursue, remedies, For example, in the US, you have the Alien Tort Statute with a bunch of conditions. If you meet, then you may have a case to bring, and there are numerous other sort of frameworks. For example, there is like a case um, against the French bank, the BNP Paribas. This is a case brought by Sudanese victims against the French bank that sort of aided and abetted the government of Sudan, the Bashir regime at the time. So those are kind of ways that you can seek redress. There are other examples, for example, in in Sweden, the London Oil Company, and there are a bunch of others. And so basically, it really depends on where you are. You can definitely seek um, um, reparations for the grievances and the harm that you endured. Um, but I must say that it's like a little bit difficult again, especially if the perpetrator is, the perpetrator has no ties uh, to, for example, to the country where you are, for example, the US or Canada. So it's hard um, to establish jurisdiction. That's number one. Um, um, what else did I want to say on this front? Uh, but it is a lot more feasible to basically, respond to the solution as a sort of more of a general sort of situation, say there are atrocities in Sudan, so we can use different international conventions and legal frameworks to hold perpetrators accountable. Or, for example, the ICC now is sort of investigating the situation in Darfur. And so victims may be subject to compensation if perpetrators are convicted, but that does not guarantee sort of personal, individual sort of reparations, maybe sort of group reparations, building schools, hospitals, and the like. Um, so yeah, so basically, yes, it's a very broad um, answer, but those are kind of things that you'd like to consider.
For the group of five question, I'm going to paste I mean, the this is the available um, policy online, and so it does look like one of the conditions is it has to be a sponsor who has not entered into a sponsorship agreement.
Um, there is a question, perhaps you want to take that, the last question about how can our findings be sort of used to support
Mm,
pro bono lawyers? This is exactly the
hmm.
reason why we're here today.
Yeah,
Perhaps you want to take that on. Yeah.
sure. Yeah. Right. Okay. Yeah, that's a great question. Well, so our report, it establishes the grounds to prove that the members of these specific targeted groups, communities, including the Fur Zagawa and the Masalit and other non-Arab groups to different extent, but um, um, you know, we've both documented the patterns and practices um, and of how the RSF carries out its atrocities and violent campaigns in Darfur, but also identified those specific groups that have been subject to the atrocities. Um, and it's beyond persecution. We're talking about genocide. So these are very clearly established in our report that was released last year, and um, this remains the most authoritative report on specifically um, showing how these groups were targeted for genocide. But as a center, we will also consider maybe issuing a supplemental or updated report based on the events in North Darfur. Um, but in our report, we do an important comparison of the Darfur genocide of 20 years ago with the present, tracing the roots of the RSF, and tracing um, the evolution of the incitement and to genocide um, policies and practices um, and the systematic nature of the violence against these groups that this report is extremely valuable in showing that in showing how deeply rooted and how easily predictable the violence against these communities is now. And so we'd be happy to discuss with specific lawyers on, but we hope that you can use this report because, this is one of the main reasons why we compiled it. And we've heard from others that it has been used to convince judges to grant asylum. And so, and what steps are needed to ensure the safety and protection of Sudanese IDPs who do not yet fall under the official refugee status. This is also, I mean, it's beyond just talking about protected groups, it's very clear that yeah, that I mean that the UNHCR already pronounced as soon as the war broke out that Sudan's not safe to return to. Um, so there's a very clear accepted understanding that that IDPs outside of Sudan cannot be returned unless and until it's safe to do so. Um, and then related to the ICJ case, can Sudanese nationals who are temporarily residing or working in the UAE reference this case in their immigration? Um, Interesting. I mean, I guess we're not so familiar with the UAE system, but um, yeah, I don't know if
Yeah.
Mutassim can share more on this.
Yeah. Well, um, I mean, surely as, as an asylee, you can use any evidence that you think will be helpful for your case, right? But in the end, when you're speaking about proving your refugee claim, then you just have to prove. I think this is consistent through all states, especially with those who have refugee laws, right? That you have a well-founded fear, well-founded fear of persecution, right? Five main grounds, right? That is that are outlined by the Geneva Convention, 1951, and its related protocols. So basically, you can make a general reference that there is like a tension between Sudan and the UAE, and therefore you're eligible for refugee status. And I think refugee attorneys can tell you this a little more in details. Um, but I think you can um, always make your case very specific, not more of a general terms. There's like a war in Sudan, there is conflict. I mean, that's helpful for the purposes of the context, but establishing your particular claims, you have to make it a lot more specific. But in the end, it also depends, as you want to mention, um, to the UAE's laws and regulations, and um, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, my inclination also is to say that UAE would do anything not to harm its like reputation so explicitly by deporting um, Sudanese nationals, but based on its conduct, it's you know, but in fueling the RSF and even both sides to some extent, I don't think there's, it yeah, it's hard to and there's, it's not a regime that has necessarily a stable rule of law. Um,
There's
don't
a yeah. That's a question. Please go ahead. I'm not sure if I have an answer to that, but
Mhm.
yeah, I guess yeah, you can reflect on that, but I guess more for um, those who focus particularly on the immigration policies in Canada. And so, um, uh, but we can also look at it and get back to you later on. But yeah, you want to please feel free to respond if you would like.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to um, presume I can give advice on this. Um, this is, yeah, I think this is a matter to ask someone who has dealt with financial contributions like this. Okay, are we running towards the end of our um, lunch and learn?
Yeah, it seems like we're towards the end, unless there are any final thoughts or um, also ideas for considerations moving forward. I think, um, um, as I mentioned earlier, I think we're not particularly sort of focused on um, offering direct sort of consultation to refugees and um, um, or migrants or immigrants, um, but um, but we're happy to support in any way we can, whether through our findings and investigations, or even through um, the connections and whatever you think that we can be helpful. Please feel free to flag them. Um, 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 I think that's uh, it.
Yeah, and thank you all for joining us. And feel free to send us feedback or be in touch.
Yeah,
Yes, thank you all
absolutely.
so much.
Absolutely. Thanks a lot for taking the time. And please follow us, support our work, and you will see more of our investigations and analysis coming.